Firstly, thank you for joining. To those to whom I have not yet met virtually or any other way, my name is Jim Burke. I'm the director of lay Augustinians for the Augustinian province of St. Thomas of Villanova. And I want to extend to you a warm welcome and a thanks for joining our discussion tonight. We try and have discussions like this throughout the year and focused on Augustinian spirituality, as well as just faith formation in the Catholic faith. And the axis of Augustinian life is community. And so sometimes that's in person at a parish, and a lot of times, or increasingly at least, that's like this, in a community of people who come together virtually. And tonight, we have people who have registered for this from literally all over the country and candidly all over the world. We have people who have registered from from pretty much every state in the Union, as well as multiple continents, and covering all kinds of time zones. And then, of course, we're recording this, and we will make it available to folks to access it at any time. So thank you for coming together. What I'm going to do right now is ask everybody, first of all, just kind of rules of the road here. I've muted all of us. You can unmute yourself to ask a question. So we'll have a lecture by Dr. Curtin. And then at the end of that lecture, there will be time for Q&A. So you can unmute yourself for that, but I'm going to ask everyone to stay muted, as otherwise it would become a little bit of a circus, as you might imagine. But with that as the ground rule, and I should also mention that if you do have a question, you can ask it at any time via the chat function.
On the west side of the road, and the vehicle
Hold on a second. Let me
get there. That's consistent with somebody throwing out the passenger window.
I got to get to the mute here.
A driver having to manage Nancy inside the vehicle is able to reach through the passenger window. Now, I know some people say, well, what if they threw it out the driver's window?
Okay, there we go. So please take one moment with me and let's offer a prayer of thanksgiving for this opportunity. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Dear God, thank you for this opportunity to come together as a community of Augustinian brothers and sisters, pursuing holiness under the tutelage of St. Augustine, and in particular tonight, under the instruction of Dr. Curtin. We thank him for his efforts preparing for this discussion and leading us through it. And we ask for your blessing on all of us, that we may understand and put into our spiritual lives the lessons that we learn tonight. Amen. In the name of the Father, Son, Holy Spirit. So I will turn it over to Dr. Curtin, who is a graduate of Villanova University, an Augustinian scholar, the author of a book available on Amazon titled The Papal Bulls of the Order of St. Augustine. He's also the author of all kinds of articles in various Catholic publications and periodicals. And he is, I think, by any definition, an Augustinian scholar. And so we are really privileged to have him with us tonight. And so I hope you enjoy our time together. And with that, Dr. Curtin, I turn it over to you. Thank you, and take it away, please.
Well, thank you for that, Jim. Good evening. So my name is Dermot Curtin. I sometimes write under the name D.P. Curtin just because my first name is aggressively Irish and people tend to be confused by it. So I'm a psychologist by training, but at least since being at Villanova, I've worked heavily in the transmission and translation of preservation of a lot of historic texts, some of which relate to the order of St. Augustine, some of which are just from the pen of the saint. This evening, it's my honor to be able to talk to you about the history of the order of St. Augustine of Hippo, where it came from, how it developed, and how it's impacted the history of the Western Church. I think everyone is semi-familiar with the Augustinian order, particularly with the election of Pope Leo XIV in Rome this past spring. But most people are perplexed exactly what this means, or what an order sometimes even is. Even people who have an intimate connection with the order are confused by other Augustinian orders, or the difference between clergy of the order or of a diocese. So when I was at Villanova, I was an undergraduate in theology some 20 years ago at this point. And at the time, the order had celebrated the 750th anniversary of its consolidation in 1255. But very few people really understood exactly what that meant, or even what was being consolidated at the time. I think every organization tends to struggle with exactly when its founding date is supposed to be. So in the cases like institutions like Villanova, if you walk around campus, you'll always see the date of 1842. It's effectively plastered on anything. I believe there's a charitable organization of that title. But the exact founding of Villanova is a little difficult, because while the school did open in 1842, it also closed in 1844, reopened in 1845, closed again in 1857. And the point of this is the exact origin is sometimes a little bit murky. And with the order, the Augustinian order in particular, that's very much the case. So, let's see if I can change slides here. Oh. This series is really intended to be a survey for those who are almost entirely unfamiliar with the history of the Order of St. Augustine or with Augustinianism. So admittedly, this is a fairly mammoth task because the wide-reaching influence of St. Augustine and the order has had over the last 15 centuries. What I've tried to create here is a little bit of a narrative that explains the continuity between the world of St. Augustine and the survival of his thought and community rule. So we see it as the formal development of the order from its origins in late antiquity up to the high medieval period, when the Augustinian order kind of reaches its zenith during the high Middle Ages. It would be very easy, especially for someone like me, to go down a number of rabbit holes here. And there are a lot of interesting things that can be talked about. But in the interest of time, I'm largely sticking to what will kind of move us along. So I've broken this down into the 4 sections that we have here. I'll be talking about this first section here today, the community as known to St. Augustine, and to a certain degree a little bit after his life, because so much of his community was attached to the African church. And we'll be continuing this, I believe, every month to go on to a new development within Augustinianism. So my lecture style is a little bit more formal. Admittedly, I'm used to addressing medical residents and preceptors of the past. So this is a little bit of a different audience from what I'm used to historically. So it's probably worth noting first and foremost that St. Augustine, at least in a formal sense, did not have anything to do with the founding of the order which bears his name. That's not to say that he had an influence. So the major orders of the Catholic Church are put forward here. And what's very unusual is that most of the figures of these orders bear the name of the founder. So for the unfamiliar, there's groups like the Franciscans, obviously founded by Francis, the Dominicans, founded by Dominic, the Benedictines, founded by Benedict, and of course the Augustinians themselves. Of all of these, the Benedictines are by far the oldest, but they're a little different because they're what we call a monastic rather than a mendicant order. And this is very significant. Monastic orders are interested, their focus is on removal from the world, removal from all things earthly. When someone enters the Benedictine order, they're issued a cell, a bed, a desk, and a skull to contemplate mortality on the human condition. This idea would be completely alien to mendicant orders, which form a little bit later in the church's history, usually during the 12th and 13th century. But we're interested in engaging with the world, with being present in urban centers and following what's usually called the apostolic tradition of traveling and engagement and regular activity. In this, the Augustinians are distinctively the latter. Their interest is in engagement and participation in community life and not removal from it. So this brings us to the topic of the African Church itself, which is a very distinctive entity. The African Church that St. Augustine knew was a very different creature to most of the rest of Latin Christianity. It's largely unfamiliar to us today, as there's no direct successor to it. I think it's probably worth noting that Africa, the title itself, is something distinctive. And at the time of Augustine, it would have referred to specifically the Roman province, which is roughly equivalent to the modern Republic of Tunisia. So its two major cities are Carthage itself, the ancient capital that spans back centuries, but also obviously the much smaller city of Hippo Regius, which is equally ancient. It was originally held by the kings of Numidia. Hippo Regius means something like royal horses, and it's presumed that it was largely a stable used for that purpose. Talking of the culture of the region, the area is not fully ethnically homogeneous, and that's probably best represented by the person of Augustine himself and his family. St. Augustine, his father Patricius, his brother Navigius, all display common Roman names, and we're all likely immersed in the world of Roman culture. They're very attached to this kind of urbane society in late antiquity. However, Augustine's mother, Monica, she bears a name that's very distinctive. It's actually the first usage of the name that we know. She's likely either of Punic or maybe even perhaps Libyan Berber descent. For other people like St. Augustine's son, Deodatus, he bears a very common Punic name. In fact, early Christians in Carthage usually used the Punic form of it rather than a Deodatus Eontenbal, which it almost sounds like it has an Old Testament association, and you'd be right in assuming that. So for people who are unfamiliar with Punic civilization as a whole, there's a short history of the region. North Africa, or at least this region of North Africa, was colonized by the Phoenicians during antiquity, culminating in the Carthaginian Republic, who fought and was eventually defeated by the Roman Empire under characters like Hannibal, usually famous with his elephants. This civilization continued on for some time. Even after the fall of the Carthaginian Republic, Roman soldiers were given a land grant in North Africa, especially in the area around Carthage. It's likely that Augustine's own patrilineal line comes from that, at least as far as we can tell. In his Confessions, Augustine actually talks quite a bit about his distinctive Africanness. One of the biggest elements of this was the African accent of Latin. Augustine, in the early part of Confessions, talks about being made fun of in school in Rome, distinctively for his inability to pronounce things because of the linguistic drift that has taken place over quite a few centuries. So also significant to this time and place is the birth of monasticism, which has this electrifying effect on Western Christianity in particular. St. Augustine notes this specifically in Book 8 of his Confessions. There was no such movement before this point. Monasticism is entirely a new phenomenon in the West, and there's a lot of considerable questions on how it's going to look, how it's going to be adapted. Characters like St. Benedict, he's yet to write his famous rule, and other people like John Cassian have yet to formalize anything. Importantly, St. Augustine doesn't draw upon the ideas of Egyptian monasticism, but he goes to other sources to try to make an equivalent to them. This includes things like the 4th chapter of Acts of the Apostles, where the early church is living in community and has this shared sense of wealth, but also to Greek ideas like the Neoplatonic idea of koinos bios. His first attempt is experimental. He's outside of Milan in a place called Cassiacum, and he and his friends form this kind of quasi-monastic community. Some of these things are relatively straightforward. They involve things like common prayer, common meals, scriptural and philosophical discussion, and importantly, things like the renunciation of professional ambition. it doesn't form anything approaching a monastic society, at least not yet. This stands very much in contrast to the austere world of the Egyptian monks. The Egyptian monks want to get away from the world in everything. They are very much monks in the original Greek meaning of the word, monachos, meaning solitary or alone. For Augustine, the role of poverty and, let's say, the sense of solitude is secondary, maybe even tertiary. What's primary is the common life, and what he calls the unity of the heart, which we'll see kind of develop further as he develops this idea. So this initial community outside of Milan lasts about a year before he returns home to Tagaste in 388. And he sells off much of his father's property, but he retains the building of the house itself, which he turns into his first community. And again, there's no sense of a formal rule. They shared goods, they pray, they study together. There's a deep emphasis on friendship when they're together. But the authority of the community is more collegial, and there aren't really clear guidelines on its governance. There's yet really to be any kind of formal institution of a community just yet. Everything is kind of community oriented towards God and a sense of separation from the rest of the world. But that's all that's really defined as of yet. With Augustine's elevation to the bishop of Hippo Regius, he founds a second community in his episcopal residence in the city. Now, we have a lot of information about the second community, through his son, St. Placidius, who was very familiar with Augustine's life. With the elevation of Augustine, we also see him starting to impose some level of discipline, because now he has a number of organizations that he has to be able to manage. He has the bishopric of Hippo itself, he has the house at Hippo, and then also at Tagaste, and he's being involved in all kinds of affairs within the broader African church. The challenge for him is there's really not any precedent for trying to establish a community like this. In general, Augustine is suspicious of the ideas of Eastern monasticism, rejecting the ideas of solitary principle and cautioning what he sees as a sense of ascetical pride, masquerading as holiness. So in an effort to better operate these two institutions, he lays down some of the precepts for the operations of a community, which will come down to us as the rule of St. Augustine. Importantly, the site of St. Augustine's home is now lost to history. If you go to Sucares in Algeria, the site of Tagaste, there's an olive tree that stands that's associated with him, but that's really about it. Despite its significance, the tumult of the following centuries kind of obscured its memory, as we'll soon see. So there's probably a lot that could be said about the rule of St. Augustine itself. In fact, I'm certain that there is. I know there's a whole series that the lay Augustinians have given that's just been directed to this singular document. At its core, the rule, there are certain ideas that are central to Augustinianism, both as a community, but also as a worldview in general. St. Augustine talks about the idea of ordered love, ordo amoris, the unity of heart again, chastity, and importantly, simplicity. But he also does something that we see in a lot of other works by him, this idea of the state of interiority. Augustine is, to a certain degree, kind of the first psychologist of the West. He wants to understand how people think and the inner motives that they have. And that comes up in the role of St. Augustine, but we also see it in other works like Confessions. This element is also significant because it starts from a presumed position of human weakness. Augustine's works really places emphasis on things like mercy and patience and growth, all elements that are necessary to maintain any kind of community, even to the present day. The Rule is probably Augustine's most significant pastoral work. The idea he lays out will come out time and time again. Like we see it again in City of God, where Augustinian thought is really given a significant political dimension. So for The last years of Augustine's life, things become very complicated in the Western Empire. In the year 429, the Vandals resumed their aggression against the Roman state and began their slow conquest of North Africa. St. Augustine was still alive at this time and assisted in refugees from the war who were held up in the walled city of Hippo Regius itself. Inevitably, there was a siege by the Vandal barbarians, during which time St. Augustine, who was then 75 years old, was killed. Eventually, the Vandals withdrew, but the Western Roman state wasn't strong enough to be able to really deter them for very long. So they do re-enter the city of Hippo Regius. So for a period of about a century, Roman Africa was ruled by this group, the Vandals, and they're very significant, ironically enough, to the spread of Augustinianism, and for reasons that seem very strange, because they sought to dismantle the Catholic Church in Africa and legitimize their own Arian church. It's the Arian church of the sense of followers of Arius who denied the divinity of Christ. Some illegitimate councils were held at the time, but nothing really stuck of the period. What's interesting and maybe even providential is the writings of St. Augustine, despite his Catholic orthodoxy, and even him sparring with Arians in the city of Milan in his youth, they were spared by the Vandal conquerors. We don't really know why. It would seem for every reason that they would want to be able to destroy these documents, but just by some fluke, they seem to have survived untouched through the Vandalic War. We see a certain progression of things like the confiscation of clergy. We actually see a lot of people being expelled at this period, expelled from Africa completely. It's really hard to be able to fully underscore the apocalyptic quality that really came along with the conquest of North Africa. The region is still scarred from it even to this day. So the fate of some of St. Augustine's friends are also worth noting. The most salient of them is St. Placidius himself, who wrote the life of St. Augustine, the Vita Augustini, which it gives us an intimate portrayal of Augustine's life. It's through him that we know about things like Augustine's reluctance about ordination and eventually things like the episcopate. Some of the emphasis that Augustine laid on things like his interest in communal life rather than this kind of hierarchical life that we see develop in the later Middle Ages. Augustine hates luxury. The household itself becomes a school for bishops in terms of charity and clarity, and even toning down things like rhetorical brilliance so that they can be accessible for other people. The life also talks about things like Augustine as sheltering these refugees, involving himself in legal disputes, ransoming local captives who have been involved in other wars or military disputes, what is sometimes called manumission. In contrast to other hagiographies of the periods about saints, there's no great visions, there's no final speech of Augustine. The emphasis lies in Augustine's own personal sense of humility. In contrast to all the other works, like the works of Augustine from his own pen, which are very philosophical. Placidius really preserves the pastoral Augustine. Some of the other friends of Augustine are also kind of contributing to this later development. Famously, Alypius, who's also one of Augustine's closest friends, continues the monastic community at Tagaste. The challenge is with the Vandal conquest, we're not really clear on what happened to many of these men. Many of them were exiled, many of them tried to flee, but a lot of them are just kind of, it's as if they disappear from history. We presume a lot of them to end up in Italy just because Italy was a safeguard, at least for the time being. Trying to be able to collapse the remaining history of the African church into a relatively short period of time. The Vandals maintain their presence in North Africa until the Emperor Justinian in the early 6th century retakes the city of Carthage and Africa in general from the Vandals themselves. And they maintain the area for at least a little while. Most of Africa at this point is largely depopulated by these wars, though. This kind of goes back and forth. Some of the Roman infrastructure of the region that we can still find in certain places, even operational in places like Spain and Italy, have been very badly damaged. And to the point where we see this in the 7th and 8th century, that the large urban populations that Augustine would have been familiar with are no longer sustainable in Tunisia or Algeria up until the modern period. Even though Rome has at least temporarily retaken Africa for some of these centuries, Augustine's works never really crossed the Latin-speaking world. Like the Greek world, for many centuries, really doesn't have any interest in Augustine. He's not even translated into Greek well until the 12th century. And even today, in certain sections of the Orthodox world, that will speak of the Blessed Augustine and they revere him as a saint. But there's always a certain degree of suspicion that comes along with that. Eventually, Roman Africa does fall, though. So the fate of Roman Africa is actually a little bit mysterious to us. Like a lot of places, we have letters and Latin documents roughly up until the year 700. And then it's as if suddenly the lights go out on the whole region. We have no information on the fate of the African church as Augustine knew it. And when the Arabs took Carthage in the year 700, they dismantled most of the stone edifices of the buildings they found to build the new regional capital of Tunis, which remains the major metropolitan city of the area even to this day. Famous places like Carthage, which are featured very prominently in places like the Confessions, still stand, but they're kind of a diminished suburb now. So in this picture on the top left, you can see the harbor, the famous Carthaginian harbor as it would have been known to Augustine, rebuilt by Julius Caesar in the year 46. And directly below it, you can see it where it currently looks now. You can still faintly see the outline of kind of the ancient symmetry that was put there, but it's a little bit more murky. Just the same, we have here on the right 2 photos of modern Annaba in Algeria, the ancient site of Hippo Regius. The one on the top right are the remains of St. Augustine's own cathedral church, which survives in a largely ruined form. As far as we can discern, Latin Christianity survived in North Africa right up until about the 11th century. We have some documents, one of the last bishops of Carthage, who writes to the Pope, talking to him about the state of the African church. But as far as we can tell, it doesn't survive long after this. Fittingly, there's tombstones of the period, which still have Latin epitaphs engraved on them. But that's really the last signs of the culture that was there, the last signs of Augustine's church. When Franciscan missionaries arrive in the region in the 13th century, they don't find any remains of the old African church. It's seemingly has vanished. The Catholic Church itself has continued to maintain the See of Carthage, the Bishop of Carthage, as an official episcopal seat up until 1964, when it was permanently discontinued. So what's really curious about the death of St. Augustine was the deeply felt respect that the barbarian Vandals had for him. The original tomb that had been built for him in Hippo Regius was protected by special order of the Vandalic royal family, especially characters like Gaiseric, who was the Vandalic king who originally besieged the city, which would lead to Augustine's death. Later, Eastern Roman authorities would take over, but starting with the Roman-Arab Wars, there was concern for the safety of the body of Augustine, and he was taken safely to the island of Sardinia to avoid any potential threats to the relic of his body. What's curious about Sardinia itself is that it's not incidental to the history of Roman Africa. The Latin tongue that Augustine would have spoken at the time has been entirely forgotten in Africa itself. But Latin Romance, or I should say African Romance, is spoken by St. Augustine. The closest living relative is the Sardinian dialect of Italian. which is far more African in some of its prosody and some of its diction as well. So with the continued push of the Arab armies, there was a number of church officials that thought it was best to take Augustine's body to the mainland, particularly with the fall of neighboring Sicily. Today, Augustine's body is at the Church of San Pietro, where it's rested since the 8th century. The movement of St. Augustine's body was also the analog for the spread of various other things throughout North Africa. We see in the 8th century a number of exiled bishops and clergymen from the African church who are living in places like Rome and Italy and France, and even as far away as northern Germany. We have African bishops who are attending the Synod of Aachen during the Carolingian period. The prologue for their exile, the reason why they're in exile, really isn't recorded. It's not known. But the diaspora of the African church is important because it helps propel the ideas of Augustine into the broader Latin world. Augustine was certainly a sentinel figure in North Africa in his own time, and he's involved in other elements of the Western church that's certainly Latin speaking, but this is the element that really makes it spread very quickly. Augustine's body, as I said, is at the Church of San Pietro, but during the French colonial period in the 19th century, his leg was actually returned to the newly created cathedral at Annaba, where it remains to this day. The spreading of Augustinian ideas takes place relatively quickly. His works aren't fully codified in his own lifetime. There's a lot of them, and they're fairly well spread out. Letters of correspondence that he has with various bishops and significant figures of the church, and even in his own lifetime. It really takes the work of St. Isidore, who is a Spanish bishop living in Seville, to really get the collection of Augustine's works off the ground. This is something that happens in the 6th and 7th century. Augustinianism really isn't even a system or even a unified school at this time. Even working with the Latin texts of Augustine to this day, we sometimes find there's a lot of confusion. Sometimes a lot of collections attribute works to Augustine that are not rightfully his, that are associated with other significant African church fathers, or they're associated with someone else called Augustine, or sometimes they're just relatively random. But the prowess of Augustine's name really comes to the forefront. At this period, especially in Western Europe, there's no universities. Western monasticism is still trying to feel its way a little bit. But Augustinian does lay a foundation for the spiritual grammar shared by most Latin bishops and monks and priests. The common mission of the church is probably best expressed using Augustinian language during this period that's commonly referred to as the Dark Ages. What's more, some of Augustine's work, like De Civitate Dei, on the City of God, they really find some of their bearing in this post-Roman society. They come to the forefront for state and legal circles, and they act as kind of transitional documents to explain some of the chaos that the West is experiencing following the collapse of Rome. So while the communities that are founded by St. Augustine collapse under the political turmoil of late Roman Africa, his ideas do find rich soil in parts of Europe associated with the Western Roman Empire. Starting fairly early on, we see papal sanctions for new communities that follow the rule of St. Augustine that have kind of organically sprung up a generation or two following his death. Augustine appears to be particularly influential in post-Roman France, particularly in the south and the coastal regions that we call Provence to this day. The church, Augustine, the Synod of Orange, which is a fairly significant early synod within the French church in 529, uses him for the first time as an authoritative source. They say Augustine has said this, ergo it carries some weight in terms of the official teachings of the church. We also start to see during this period Augustinian themes start to emerge in the papal court, particularly in the figure of Pope Gregory I, sometimes called Gregory the Great, who quotes Augustine frequently in his writing, and he's the first pope to really do so. So we see the immersion of Augustine out of Africa into kind of the mainstream of Western Christian dialogue. This period of church history, the kind of the beginning of the Dark Ages, is also dominated by a figure like Saint Benedict, who's considered the father of Western monasticism, rightfully so. And while Benedict doesn't directly quote from Augustine himself, a lot of the things that he says are very clearly Augustinian ideas. Some of the things that he talks about, things like the Ordo Amoris, the order of love, the community as a school of charity, and things like the humility of truth that has to be really truly understood before God, are all ideas that can be drawn directly from Augustine and some of his later influence. Also on this period, and I know this has been a point of regular confusion, we need to talk about this very similar group that's developed in the Dark Ages that is distinctively different from the modern order of St. Augustine. I don't think most people really talk of canons today in a clerical sense. It's an unusual title, but it's very much present in the medieval world and well up until the 16th century. The earliest form of an Augustinian community is this group. They're called Canons Regular of St. Augustine. Canons is a Greek word meaning a rule or something like living under a rule. Augustine's rule was very popular in the Western world, and as such, during the Dark Ages, we see the formation of communities of priests living together under the Augustinian rule. In particular, we see them develop in France and in northern Italy fairly early on. However, like the Benedictines, every house of these canons regular are governed independently. They're all singular independent communities that practice some of the Augustinian rules, but are not part of a broader mendicant order. So I think to be able to help clarify this, I've created a little bit of a chart to be able to help separate the two. Significant is their name. Now, the Order of St. Augustine is officially the Brothers of the Hermits of the Order of St. Augustine. That term brothers is very much a distinctive mendicant term. It's something that comes out of the parlance of the 12th and the 13th century. It comes from the French word brother, a frere, friar, or in the Latin sense, frateros. And the term brother here is something that's distinctive to the Order of St. Augustine. It is a little bit of a confusing turn of phrase, especially with the length of the name. So we talk of the Brothers of the Order of the Hermits of St. Augustine. Years ago, my wife worked at St. Rita of Cassica, the shrine in South Philadelphia. And so the official title of the shrine was attached to the Brothers of the Order of the Hermits of St. Augustine of St. Rita of Cassica. So in an effort to try to be able to abridge that, her paycheck would show up as Brothers of the ... payroll. We'll talk more about mendicantism, which is a significant element of the Order of St. Augustine later, and defining some of the features of the order. However, it's important to be able to talk about the separation here from the canons, because the canons really represent this first incarnation. Sometimes they're referred to as the ordo antiques, the old order, the oldest order that we really understand in terms of like being able to structure the church and monastic life in a relatively systematic way. The Augustinian canons, who still exist, bear a number of differences, which we have spelled out here between themselves and the modern order of St. Augustine. But most of these really have to do with the separation. The separation between them is largely a clerical distinction. The Brothers of the Order of the Hermits of St. Augustine are originally created as a lay order. They're interested in being brothers, while the canons are distinctively clerical. And this has come up and become very salient, especially in our own time with the election of Pope Leo, when there was some considerable confusion on the subject. So to be able to spell things out clearly right now, Leo is the first pope from the Order of St. Augustine. He is a friar. However, he's not the first Augustinian pope, at least not in the strictest sense. There have been 4 other popes that have previously reigned: Honorius II, Innocent II, Adrian IV, and Eugenius IV, who are all Augustinians in the sense of being canons regular. I know for quite a while there was some confusion on exactly what that means. So I think that's probably a good stopping off point for there.
Thank you. Do you prefer Dr. Curtin or DP or Dermot or some other?
You can call me Dermot. That's not a problem.
Thank you, Dermot. We have a couple of questions in the chat right now, and which I'll tee up. Why is there no longer a Bishop of Carthage as of 1964? I don't know if you know the answer to that, because I do not.
So in the past, the Catholic Church wanted to maintain what they were considered to be significant sees, significant bishops of the church. So they maintained one in Carthage, which has an ancient foundation going back to all the way to the early apostles. They also maintained what they called the Latin Patriarch of Alexandria and the Latin Patriarch of Constantinople, intended to be somewhat of a rival to the Greek Orthodox Patriarch, the Ecumenical Patriarch in Constantinople, and also the Coptic Patriarch, in an effort to be a little bit more ecumenical and try to extend the olive branch to Eastern churches. The Second Vatican Council had removed those 2 offices. Carthage was removed at the same time for similar reasons. It didn't really serve any functional purpose anymore. There are some Catholics in Algeria and Tunisia today, but they're very few. During the French colonial period, there were significantly more, but with the French withdrawal, that presence basically evaporated overnight.
Thank you very much. Will we have access to the slides after the session? First of all, the recording will be available on the website, and then Dermot, perhaps we can also just make like the slides available as a separate, separately from the recording on the website, if you're open to that. But I will leave it to you, and we can decide how you want to handle that after this, if you'd like.
Yeah, there's nothing like copyrighted material here. Everything's pretty straightforward. I know I was trying to cover a lot of bases to explain the order via Augustine to how it kind of made its journey into Western European monasticism. I do include my email here on this last slide in case there are any additional questions or something that maybe people want to expand upon.
That's great. Thank you. That's very generous. And I also would remind everybody, this is the first of 4 parts. The story continues, and we will send out invites for session 2, which will be basically a month from today, the second Wednesday in March. Next question. Thank you. Please recommend a modern English translation of Augustine's Confessions. Do you have one you prefer?
I would recommend the Irish priest, who's also an Augustinian himself, Benignus O'Rourke.
Okay.
I think he's came out maybe 10 or 15 years ago.
Can you spell that, please?
Like myself, he does have an aggressively Irish name. Benignus was the first disciple of St. Patrick. I believe it's Benignus.
Yeah, and then O'Rourke.
Yes, O'Rourke is a little bit more common.
O'Rourke is more straightforward.
Yeah.
In what ways did Proclus contribute to writing the Rule of St. Augustine?
That is a very good question, but it's probably also beyond my unlimited competency as a lay scholar.
Fair enough. Maybe on a future session, we can ask Father Alan Fitzgerald to join us, one of our beloved friars, and also extraordinarily scholarly in all things Augustinian. Would you recommend Pisidius's biography of Augustinian for non-academics?
Pisidius is very readable. So I really enjoyed him because you get insights about his life, Augustine's life, that Confessions and even his own writing doesn't really give you. There's one element that I found was very insightful as a psychologist. Clearly, in reading Confessions, Augustine talks about ideas of his own sexual addiction. His famous quote, "Lord, give me chastity, just not yet." Pisidius gives a little bit more light into that in terms of his own personal life. For Augustine, he apparently was in such of the depths of addiction that he could not have women even come into his house. Not his sister, not his nieces later on in life, not even someone to clean the house. That's a very interesting sight because it sounds like he's very acutely aware of his own psychology, what my psychoanalytical friends would talk about in terms of having a sense of an observing ego. He knows the potential triggers that will get him into trouble.
Interesting. Is there a central place or book for all its information? Is it included in your book, Dermot?
So my book is a collection of the papal documents. This is really something that comes out in the third section of this survey. When the Augustinian order starts to develop in kind of an embryonic form. So it's, as I mentioned, unlike the other orders, it just doesn't appear one day with a distinctive founder, but it's the consolidation of various efforts that are taking place with a lot of hermits that are taking refuge in places like Tuscany in northern Italy. There's a few good books in terms of Augustine and his thought. Personally, I'm a big fan of The Restless Heart by the late Father Tom Martin, who was a Villanova professor for many years. I think if you're really trying to be able to encapsulate Augustinian spirituality in a way that's accessible for all lay people, that's probably your best bet.
Excellent. Thank you. Nisha, yes. And for anyone else who's on the Zoom and is pursuing making promises in the third order, the lay Augustinian, yes, by all means, participation tonight is an indication of your connection to the community. You will not get a certificate, but it is duly noted. And then several data boys, Dermot, and then given how widely Augustinian influenced Western civilization, is it surprising that the Augustinians are a smaller order? Any insights? Interesting question.
So I know I was speaking the other night about when exactly the Augustinian order hit its zenith. I know I suggested that it was probably sometime in the High Middle Ages, just because the Augustinian order would become a little bit of a hot button when it came to the Protestant Reformation in the 16th century. Luther himself is an Augustinian friar. So much of his thought is derived from his own interpretation of Augustine. At least in terms of the numbers, the Order of St. Augustine probably hit its high water mark right before the French Revolution, though. Especially its expansive influence in Latin America, especially under the Spanish Empire. The size of the orders is kind of a challenging thing, and especially when it comes to influence. So certainly there's been tremendous influence posed by the other mendicant orders, the Dominicans and the Franciscans, but the thought of St. Augustine is so pervasive in our culture that sometimes we don't even necessarily recognize it. This whole sense of doubting our own human nature, it cuts across things like things that we wouldn't even consider, things like law. There's a reason why places like Villanova University maintain a law school, because a lot of Augustine's early work was as a jurist. and he was very interested in the ideas of natural law and how they applied to society and civilization. So I guess it's a difficult question because Augustinianism has its influence in terms of the church, especially right now, but it also has a broader impact on the rest of civilization. Even figures like Aquinas admit that they are so deeply in debt to the work of Augustine and some of the broader corpus of his works.
Thank you. And I will bring forward this one last question, then we'll cut it off for this evening. Although, as Dr. Curtin indicated, he made his email available. My email is available. We would be happy to take any additional questions that may come up after the call tonight. But to close us off, did the book by Thomas A. Kempis, The Imitation of Christ, have considerable influence on the order or the acceptance of it? I understand that Kempis was an Augustinian. I am unfamiliar with that.
So I'm familiar with the book. I don't know about it. The consolidation of the order later on, it's a little confusing. So part of this survey is to be able to explain that process a little bit better. Because it wasn't a point where suddenly the Pope just kind of snaps his fingers and the Augustinian order exists. There's a question of exactly how to create this. There's some of the challenge with reading Augustine is not only the extensive number of documents that he touched, which is the largest of any figure from late antiquity, but also his interpretation, because like all of us, he has a 40-year span of writing, and in that time period, his thinking changes. He even writes a book about it. He writes a book called Retractions, where he says, these are all the things that I got wrong when I was young, and this is why you shouldn't listen to me.
Excellent. So I will close the way I began. Thank you all for joining. And thank you, Dr. Curtin, for preparing and leading us through this lecture. From my own personal point of view, just as kind of an Augustinian among all of you on this side of the screen, this is excellent. I learned a ton. It was really terrific. I don't think we've ever had this many questions at the end of a lecture, which is outstanding. And so I certainly hope that you all will continue with us next month. Please, share this with those you know and love. And as I mentioned, the recording will be available on the website. Give us about a day or so. So thank you again to you all. God bless you. Peace to you all, and good night.